The photograph is yellowed with age, its edges crumbling like ash. In it, 17 faces stare back through the decades, their eyes holding something that cannot be named. They stand before a wooden house in the hollow country of eastern Kentucky, the year 1887 written in faded ink along the bottom. But it is not their clothing or their stern expressions that disturb those who see this image. It is the way they stand, too close, too similar. And in the back row, partly obscured by shadow, there is a figure that appears in no family record, no census document, no grave. The Whitford family had a secret, and by the time anyone thought to ask questions, it was far too late to find answers that made sense. In the autumn of that year, a country doctor rode into Harlan County and discovered something in those mountains that would haunt him until his death 30 years later. He wrote only one sentence about it in his journal before he sealed the pages and instructed his son to burn them unread. The son did not obey. What he found written there spoke of bloodlines twisted back upon themselves, of children born with conditions no medical text could explain, and of a family tree that had grown in upon itself like roots in poisoned soil. This is not a story with easy answers. This is not a case that closes with relief. This is the Whitford family, and what they became in the isolation of those ancient hills. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitford family arrived in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1861, during the first autumn of the Civil War. They were led by patriarch Josiah Whitford, a man of 42 years, his wife Constance, and their 6 children. They came from Virginia, though the records show conflicting accounts of exactly where. Some documents list Richmond. Others mention a small settlement near the border that no longer exists on any map. They settled in a hollow so remote that the nearest town, Cumberland Gap, required a full day's journey on horseback through terrain that tested even experienced riders. The hollow had no name then. The few locals who knew of it called it simply the Far Place, and they had their reasons for keeping distance. The land was fertile but strange. Animals avoided certain areas. Trees grew in unusual patterns, their trunks twisted as if writhing away from something beneath the soil. But Josiah Whitford saw only opportunity. He purchased 200 acres for a price that seemed too good, built a large timber house, and set about establishing what he called in his letters, a family compound where the Whitford name would flourish undisturbed by the chaos of the outside world. Those letters, preserved now in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, reveal a man obsessed with bloodline and legacy. In one letter to his brother, who remained in Virginia, Josiah wrote, "The old families understood what we have forgotten, purity of line, strength through unity. The Whitfords shall not dilute what centuries have refined." His brother's response, if any, has not survived. The family kept largely to themselves, venturing to town only twice yearly for supplies they could not produce. They attended no church, participated in no community gatherings, and rebuffed attempts by neighbors to establish friendships. A circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Aldridge wrote in 1865 that he attempted 3 times to visit the Whitford home to minister to the family, and each time was turned away at the property boundary by Josiah himself, who informed him that the Whitfords keep their own counsel with the Almighty and require no intermediary. The Reverend noted in his journal that he glimpsed several children watching from the windows of the house, and their faces troubled him, though he could not articulate why. He wrote only that they seemed too alike, as if cast from a single mold with slight variations, like coins struck from a die that had begun to wear. By 1870, the original 6 Whitford children had reached marriageable age. The oldest, Samuel, was 19. His sister Margaret was 17. The youngest, Ruth, was 13. It was then that the pattern began, though it would be years before anyone outside the family understood what was happening in that isolated hollow. The Cumberland Gap town records show no marriage licenses issued to any Whitford children to anyone outside the family name. Yet by 1872, the household had expanded. The census taker that year, a man named Horace Tilden, recorded his visit in unusually detailed notes that were found among his personal effects after his death. He wrote that the Whitford compound now housed 23 individuals, all bearing the surname Whitford. When he inquired about marriages and births, Josiah informed him that such matters were handled privately, according to family custom and the old ways. Tilden noted that several of the younger adults appeared to be couples, but when he asked to record their marriage details for official purposes, Josiah became hostile and ordered him to finish his counting and leave. Tilden wrote, "I observed that many of the children bore a striking resemblance not merely to each other, but to their parents in ways that seemed to exceed normal family similarity. Two of the boys, who I was told were brothers, appeared nearly identical, yet they were said to be 2 years apart in age. Several of the younger children had unusual features I shall not detail here, as I cannot be certain my observations were accurate in the dim light of that house." He added one final note. The family atmosphere was one of intense insularity. They watched each other constantly. The children did not play or laugh, and there was among them a girl of perhaps 6 or 7 years who sat in the corner and did nothing but rock back and forth, humming a single note for the entire duration of my visit. When I inquired about her welfare, I was told she was quite well and that was simply her nature. The town of Cumberland Gap began to whisper. Traders who made deliveries to the Whitford property reported strange occurrences. Animals that strayed onto the land would return skittish and refuse to approach the property again. Dogs would bark incessantly at the boundary line but would not cross it. One trader, Samuel Bickford, claimed that he once arrived to find the entire family, more than 20 of them, standing in complete silence in front of their house, facing the woods. They did not acknowledge his arrival. He unloaded his delivery, took his payment which had been left in a box by the road, and departed. He said he could feel their eyes on his back the entire time, though when he glanced over his shoulder, none of them had moved or turned their heads. He never returned. He paid another trader double to take his route. But the most disturbing accounts came from the midwife, a woman named Ida Perkins, who served the county for 40 years and delivered more than 300 bobbies. In 1876, she was summoned to the Whitford property to assist with a difficult birth. She arrived to find a young woman in labor, no more than 16 years old. The young woman's name was Margaret, and Ida recognized her as one of the original Whitford children she had seen years before in town. Sitting beside Margaret, holding her hand, was a young man Ida also recognized. His name was Samuel, Margaret's brother. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Ida Perkins delivered the child, a boy, but she later told her daughter that something about the birth was wrong. She said the child's proportions were unusual, his head slightly too large, his limbs slightly too thin. But more disturbing was the atmosphere in the room. Multiple family members crowded the doorway, watching in complete silence. When the baby cried, none of them smiled or expressed relief. They simply stared. Ida asked Margaret if this was her first child, and Margaret said no, it was her third. Ida asked where the other children were, and Margaret pointed to 2 small forms lying on a bed in the corner of the room. Ida approached and found 2 infants, both dead. One could not have been more than a week old, the other perhaps a month. Neither had been buried. When Ida demanded to know why these dead children were simply lying there, Josiah Whitford, who had entered the room, told her calmly that some seeds do not take root, and we wait to see which ones will grow before we commit them to earth. Ida Perkins left the property immediately after ensuring Margaret was stable. She went directly to the county sheriff, a man named Robert Kane, and reported what she had seen. Sheriff Kane rode out to the Whitford property the next day with 2 deputies. They were met at the boundary by Josiah and 4 of his adult sons. Josiah informed them that the midwife had misunderstood what she had seen. The 2 infants had died tragically and were awaiting burial according to family custom, which required 3 days of viewing. He invited the sheriff to inspect the home if he wished, but his tone made clear that such an inspection would not be welcome and would violate the family's privacy. Sheriff Kane was in a difficult position. There was no specific law against keeping deceased infants in one's home for a period before burial, however disturbing it might seem. He had no evidence of a crime, only the unsettled report of a midwife. He interviewed Ida again, and she stood by her account but could offer nothing more concrete. The sheriff filed a report noting the incident and stating that the Whitford family engaged in unusual customs that, while disturbing to civilized sensibilities, do not appear to violate territorial law. But he added a personal note at the bottom of the report. I do not trust the patriarch Josiah Whitford. His eyes are the eyes of a man who believes himself above the laws of both God and man. I recommend that the family be watched, though I confess I do not know what we are watching for. No such watch was ever established. The sheriff's office was understaffed, the territory vast, and the Whitford family, for all their strangeness, caused no obvious trouble. Years passed. The family grew. By 1880, the compound housed 37 individuals. Every single one bore the last name Whitford. The census records from that year, examined closely, reveal an unsettling truth. Of the 23 adults living on the property, at least 14 were the children of Josiah and Constance. The remaining 9 were listed as grandchildren or cousins, but the marriages recorded within the family documents, such as they were, showed a pattern that would have been obvious to anyone who studied them carefully. Samuel Whitford had married his sister Margaret. Their brother Josiah Jr. had married his first cousin Anne. Anne's sister Mary had married another first cousin, Thomas, and the pattern continued downward through the generation. First cousins marrying first cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and in at least 2 documented cases, siblings marrying each other. The town of Cumberland Gap knew something was wrong, but the nature of Appalachian culture in that era was such that families were expected to manage their own affairs. Privacy was sacred. What happened in a man's home was his own business, provided it did not spill into the community. And the Whitfords, isolated as they were, remained contained. They bothered no one. They broke no laws that could be proven. They simply existed in their hollow, growing ever more numerous and ever more strange. But in 1884, something happened that could not be ignored. A Whitford daughter named Eliza, aged 21, appeared in Cumberland Gap in the middle of the night, barefoot and wearing only a nightgown. She was covered in blood. She walked down the main street screaming until she collapsed in front of the general store. The night watchman, a man named Porter Hayes, rushed to her aid. He later testified that she was incoherent, babbling about the children that should not be, and the circle closing, and what father has done to the blood. She had deep scratches on her arms that appeared self-inflicted. Porter wrapped her in a blanket and summoned the town doctor, a man named Edward Pryor, who had replaced the previous physician. Dr. Pryor examined Eliza and found her physically healthy apart from the scratches and severe exhaustion, but her mental state was fractured. She alternated between moments of lucidity and periods of dissociation, where she seemed unaware of her surroundings. During one lucid moment, she grabbed Dr. Pryor's arm and begged him not to send her back to the hollow. She said that her father had promised her in marriage to her own brother, and she had refused, and her father had locked her in the cellar for 16 days with no light and only enough food to keep her alive. She said there were things wrong with the youngest children, things she could not speak aloud, and that the family's blood had become poisoned. Dr. Pryor immediately informed Sheriff Kane, who had kept his position. The sheriff rode out to the Whitford property with 4 armed deputies, determined this time to conduct a proper investigation. They arrived to find the family assembled in front of the house, just as the traitor Samuel Bickford had described years before. All of them, men, women, and children, standing in complete silence. Josiah Whitford stepped forward and asked the sheriff his business. Sheriff Kane informed him that his daughter Eliza had appeared in town making serious accusations, and that he was there to investigate her claims and to ensure the welfare of all individuals on the property, particularly the children. Josiah replied that Eliza was not well in her mind, that she had suffered spells of madness since childhood, and that she had fled during one such episode. He expressed concern for her welfare and requested that she be returned to the family's care. The sheriff refused. He demanded to inspect the property. Josiah refused to grant entry without a warrant. It was a legal standoff. Sheriff Kane had no warrant. He had only the accusations of a young woman whose mental state was questionable. He could force his way onto the property, but doing so without legal grounds would invalidate anything he found and potentially cost him his position. Frustrated, he returned to town and filed for a warrant, citing Eliza's testimony as probable cause of unlawful imprisonment and potential abuse of minors. The warrant was issued 2 days later by Judge Cornelius Stone, who noted in his order that the Whitford family's reputation for isolation and unusual customs warranted official scrutiny. Sheriff Kane returned to the Hollow with 6 deputies and the warrant. They arrived to find the property abandoned. Every building stood empty. The house, the barn, 2 smaller cabins, all vacated. The family was gone. Every single member. 37 people had vanished into the mountains without a trace. The sheriff's search party found signs of hurried departure. Food still on the table spoiling, beds unmade, clothing left behind. But all personal documents, all family records, all photographs, everything that might have provided insight into the family's history or practices had been taken. The most disturbing discovery was made in the cellar of the main house. There they found a small room, no more than 6 feet by 8 feet, with a heavy door that locked from the outside. The room was empty except for a bucket and a pile of dirty straw. Scratches covered the walls, deep gouges made by fingernails, and written on one wall, carved into the wood with what must have been a nail or sharp stone, were the words, "God forgive what we have become." The search party expanded into the surrounding woods. They found paths leading in multiple directions, but the mountain terrain made tracking impossible. It was as if the family had dissolved into the wilderness. For 3 days, searchers combed the area. They found no trace. No camps, no supplies, no indication of where more than 30 people could have gone. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Eliza Whitford remained in Cumberland Gap, taken in by a local family named the Martins, who operated a boarding house. Dr. Pryor visited her regularly, attempting to understand her mental state and learn more about what had happened in that isolated compound. Over the following weeks, Eliza gradually became more coherent. What she revealed painted a picture of multi-generational horror that few could comprehend. She explained that her grandfather, Josiah Whitford, had believed that the strength of a bloodline came from its purity. He believed that families weakened themselves by marrying outsiders, diluting what he called the essential character of the blood. He had taught his children that the Whitfords were descended from old European nobility, though he could provide no documentation of this claim, and that it was their duty to preserve this heritage through careful breeding. Careful breeding meant keeping marriages within the family. The practice had begun with the first generation. Samuel and Margaret's union had been arranged by their father. Other siblings were paired with cousins, and the pattern had been maintained and intensified with each new generation. By the time Eliza was born in 1863, the family tree had become so intertwined that calculating exact relationships became nearly impossible. Eliza herself was the daughter of first cousins who were also the children of siblings from the previous generation. Her family tree didn't branch. It coiled like a serpent eating its own tail. The children born from these unions, Eliza said, were not all healthy. Many died in infancy. Those who survived often bore unusual features or suffered conditions that Dr. Pryor, when Eliza described them, recognized as likely the result of inbreeding: cognitive impairments, physical deformities, seizures that began in early childhood and worsened with age. Eliza spoke of her youngest sister, a girl named Hannah, born in 1882. Hannah could not speak. She could not walk. She spent her days lying on a bed, her limbs twisted at odd angles, her eyes rolling without focus. Yet the family insisted that Hannah was blessed and pure, and that her condition was a sign of the family's unique nature rather than a tragedy to be mourned. Eliza told Dr. Pryor that she had begged her father to allow her to marry outside the family, to find a husband in town to escape. He had refused absolutely. He told her that the Whitford blood must not be corrupted, that she was promised to her brother Thomas, and that she would fulfill her duty to the family line. When she continued to resist, he locked her in the cellar, visiting once a day to ask if she was ready to accept her obligation. After 16 days, the door had been left unlocked by mistake, or perhaps by someone taking pity on her. She had fled in the night, running the entire distance to Cumberland Gap through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in darkness. She said she would rather die than return to that place. Dr. Pryor documented everything Eliza told him in meticulous detail. He had studied medicine at the University of Virginia and was familiar with emerging theories about heredity and the dangers of consanguineous marriage. What Eliza described fit perfectly with what the medical literature was beginning to understand about the concentration of recessive genetic traits. But the emotional and psychological damage was beyond what any textbook addressed. Eliza suffered nightmares every night. She would wake screaming about dead bobbies and twisted children, and the sound of her father's voice telling her that the blood must remain pure. Dr. Pryor did what he could, but the field of psychiatry was in its infancy, and trauma of this depth had no effective treatment. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Whitford family's disappearance continued but yielded nothing. Sheriff Kane sent notices to surrounding counties and territories, describing the family and requesting any information about their whereabouts. No responses ever came. It was as if 37 people had ceased to exist. Judge Stone officially declared the property abandoned and ordered it sold at auction to cover unpaid taxes. The auction was held in October of 1884. Not a single person bid on the land. The place had acquired a reputation. Locals called it cursed. Stories spread about strange lights seen in the hollow at night, about voices heard singing in harmony when no one was there, about travelers who ventured too close to the property and fell ill with fevers that doctors could not explain. The property remained unsold. The buildings began to decay. The Whitford Hollow became a place that people avoided. Eliza Whitford lived with the Martins for 2 years. She learned to read and write under their care, skills her family had never taught her beyond the basics. She began attending church, something she had never done in her entire life. Slowly, she built a life separate from the horror of her childhood. In 1886, she married a local carpenter named James Porter, a kind man 15 years her senior who treated her with gentleness and patience. They had one child, a daughter they named Grace, born healthy in 1887. For a brief time, it seemed that Eliza had escaped her past, but in November of that same year, Eliza received a letter. It was delivered to the Porter home by a drifter who claimed a man had paid him 50 cents to carry it from somewhere in the mountains. The letter was addressed to Eliza Whitford Porter in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her father's. The letter was short. Daughter, we have found a new place deeper and more hidden than before. We continue the work. The bloodline grows stronger. You abandoned your duty, but others have taken your place. Know that we watch. Know that the Whitford blood calls to itself. Your daughter Grace carries it. When she comes of age, she will feel the pull as all our blood does. You cannot escape what you are. The circle is not broken. It has only expanded. Your father, who still loves you. Eliza collapsed after reading the letter. Dr. Pryor was summoned. She showed him the letter, and he immediately contacted Sheriff Kane. The sheriff questioned the drifter, but the man could provide no useful information. He had been approached on a mountain trail by a tall man with a gray beard who gave him the letter and the money and directions to Cumberland Gap. He could not describe the location. One mountain trail looked like every other. The letter sent Eliza into a spiral of terror. She became convinced that her family was watching her, that they would come for her daughter, that the horror she had escaped was not truly over. Dr. Pryor tried to reassure her that her father's words were simply meant to torment her, that the family had no power over her new life. But Eliza could not be comforted. She began having visions, or so she claimed. She said she would wake in the night to see her brother Thomas standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with empty eyes. She said she heard her mother's voice calling Grace's name from the woods behind their house. Her husband James was patient, but the strain on their marriage was immense. In January of 1888, Eliza Whitford Porter walked into the woods behind her home and hanged herself from a tree. She left no note. Her daughter Grace, only 7 months old, was raised by James and later by his sister when James could not manage both work and child-rearing. The entire town mourned Eliza, and many blamed the Whitford family for her death as surely as if they had tied the rope themselves. Dr. Edward Pryor was deeply affected by Eliza's suicide. He felt he had failed her, though he had done everything in his power to help. He became obsessed with the case, spending his limited free time researching inbreeding, heredity, and the psychological effects of isolation and abuse. He wrote letters to medical colleagues in larger cities, describing the case without names and asking for insight. Most dismissed it as a tragic but not uncommon situation in remote areas where families became too isolated. But one colleague, a doctor named Heinrich Muller who taught at Johns Hopkins University, responded with interest. Dr. Muller had been studying the effects of consanguineous marriage in European royal families and had documented similar patterns of genetic deterioration. He encouraged Dr. Pryor to document everything he knew about the Whitford case for the medical literature, arguing that such cases, while disturbing, were essential to understanding human heredity. Dr. Pryor began compiling his notes. He interviewed everyone who had ever had contact with the Whitford family. He examined the abandoned property, sketching diagrams of the buildings and making notes about the items left behind. He obtained Eliza's testimony from his own records and attempted to construct a family tree based on her information. What emerged was a document that Dr. Pryor called A Study in Isolation, Consanguinity, and Degeneration. It was 40 pages long, filled with medical terminology and genetic theory, but at its heart was the simple, terrible story of a family that had destroyed itself from within by refusing to accept that blood, however pure one imagines it to be, cannot sustain itself in an ever-tightening circle. Dr. Pryor sent his study to Dr. Muller in Baltimore in March of 1888. Muller responded enthusiastically, praising the work and requesting permission to share it with colleagues. But before any publication could be arranged, something happened that brought the entire matter back to the forefront in the most disturbing way possible. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In May of 1888, a trapper named Elijah Boone was working in the deep mountains about 30 miles from Cumberland Gap. In an area so remote that it appeared on no maps and was known to only a handful of mountain men who worked the region. Elijah was checking his trap lines when he noticed smoke rising from a valley below. Curious and always interested in meeting fellow mountain dwellers, he made his way down through difficult terrain to investigate. What he found was a settlement. 7 or 8 structures, all built from timber, arranged in a rough circle in a meadow beside a stream. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Laundry hung on lines between trees. It appeared to be a small, isolated homestead. As Elijah approached, he called out a greeting. No one responded. He entered the clearing and called again, still nothing. The settlement was silent despite clear signs of recent activity. Fire still burned in one of the outdoor pits. Food was being prepared on a table, but there were no people. Elijah began to feel uneasy. He walked to the nearest structure and knocked on the door frame. The door was open. He peered inside and saw a single large room with multiple beds, a table and chairs. The furnishings were simple but well made, and on the wall he saw something that made him step back in alarm. A large family tree had been drawn directly on the wood, names connected by lines showing relationships. At the top were 2 names, Josiah and Constance Whitford. Elijah Boone was literate, unusual for a mountain trapper, but he had been educated as a young man before choosing the wilderness life. He examined the family tree and quickly understood what he was seeing. The pattern of marriages was unmistakable: brother to sister, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece. The tree didn't spread outward as family trees should. It curved back on itself repeatedly, creating loops and spirals that hurt the eyes to follow. At the bottom of the tree were the newest generation, children born in the last few years. There were names he recognized, including Samuel and Margaret, and written at the very bottom in different ink as if added recently was a name that made Elijah's blood run cold: Grace Porter, daughter of Eliza, born 1887. They knew about Eliza's child. They were tracking her. Elijah searched the other buildings. All were empty. All showed signs of recent occupation. In one he found a room containing 5 small beds, each bed occupied by a child. But these children were not asleep. They were dead, all 5. They appeared to have been dead for several days. The bodies had been carefully arranged, hands folded, eyes closed. They ranged in age from perhaps 2 years to 7 or 8. Elijah, hardened as he was by years in the wilderness, was overcome. He stumbled out of the building and vomited. He stood in the clearing, trying to understand what he had found. And then he heard them, singing, coming from the woods to the east. Many voices singing in harmony a hymn he did not recognize. The voices grew closer. Elijah Boone did not wait to see who was approaching. He ran. He left his pack, his supplies, everything, and he ran back up the mountain slope as fast as the terrain allowed. He heard the singing stop. He heard voices calling out, though he could not make out the words. He did not look back. He climbed for hours until he was certain he was far away, then he kept climbing. He did not stop until he reached a ridge he recognized, and even then he did not rest long. He made his way to the nearest settlement, a mining camp called Harlan's Creek, and reported what he had found to the camp supervisor, a man named Walter Driscoll. Driscoll, skeptical but concerned, organized a group of men to investigate. They rode out the next morning, guided by Elijah's directions. It took them 2 days to find the valley. When they arrived, they found the settlement exactly as Elijah had described it, but the bodies were gone. The building where Elijah had seen the 5 dead children was empty. The beds were still there, but they were now neatly made with no signs that anyone had ever lain in them. The family tree remained on the wall. Everything else was as Elijah had described, but there were no bodies and no people. The searchers spread out looking for graves or any sign of where the bodies might have been taken. They found nothing. The valley itself seemed to swallow sound. Their voices did not echo. The birds did not sing. One of the men, a miner named Joseph Keller, later said that the place felt wrong in a way he could not explain, as if the land itself was sick. The group decided to wait, hoping the inhabitants might return. They camped in the clearing for 2 days. On the second night they heard the singing. It came from the woods to the east, just as Elijah had described. Many voices in harmony, but it did not sound like any hymn the men knew. The melody was strange, modal, with intervals that seemed off. The words, if there were words, were not in English. The men grabbed their rifles and called out, identifying themselves and demanding that whoever was out there show themselves. The singing stopped immediately. Then, from the darkness beyond their firelight, a voice called back. It was a man's voice, strong and commanding. It said, "You are on our land. You have no business here. Leave now or you will not leave at all." Walter Driscoll called back, asking who was speaking and stating that they were there to investigate reports of dead children and to ensure that no crimes had been committed. The voice responded, "The children are at peace. They were not suited for this world. We released them with love, as is our way. You understand nothing of our purpose. You understand nothing of blood and continuity. Leave." The men conferred quickly. They were outnumbered. They could hear many people moving in the woods around them, and they were in unfamiliar territory. Driscoll made the decision to withdraw. They packed their camp and left the valley before dawn, riding hard until they reached the safety of the mining camp. Walter Driscoll reported everything to the county sheriff, who by this time was a new man named Daniel Frost, Sheriff Kane having retired. Sheriff Frost organized the largest search party he could muster. 23 men, and they rode into the mountains with the intention of arresting everyone in the settlement and bringing them to justice for murder. They reached the valley after 3 days of difficult travel. The settlement was gone. Every building had been dismantled. The logs, the furniture, the tools, everything had been removed. The clearing where the structures had stood showed no trace of construction. Grass had already begun to grow over the bare earth where foundations had been. It was impossible. No group of people could dismantle an entire settlement and remove all trace of it in the time that had elapsed. The men searched for days. They found no trails, no camps, no sign that dozens of people had moved through the wilderness carrying the materials from 8 buildings. It was as if the settlement had never existed. The only evidence was the testimony of the witnesses, and even some of them began to doubt what they had seen. Elijah Boone swore until his dying day that he had seen what he had seen. The 5 dead children, the family tree on the wall, the voices singing in the woods. But without physical evidence, there was nothing to investigate. The case was filed as unresolved, and once again the Whitford family had vanished. But this time something had been learned. They were still together. They were still following their patriarch's vision of a pure bloodline, and they were still having children who apparently did not all survive. The implications were too terrible to fully contemplate. How many children had been born into this family? How many had lived? How many had been released with love because they were not suited for this world? Dr. Edward Pryor added this new information to his study, which was growing into something far larger than a medical case report. It was becoming a chronicle of multi-generational madness, a document that traced the complete disintegration of a family that had isolated itself so completely that it had severed all connections to normal human society and morality. Pryor showed his expanded study to several colleagues, and their reactions were uniformly disturbed. One doctor suggested that the study should not be published because it might inspire similar behavior in other isolated families. Another argued that it should be published precisely because it demonstrated the dire consequences of such behavior. In the end, Dr. Pryor kept the study private, sharing it only with select colleagues and depositing a copy with the Kentucky Medical Society with instructions that it remain sealed for 20 years. His reasoning was that some of the individuals mentioned, particularly Grace Porter, Eliza's daughter, might still be alive and did not deserve to have their family's shame made public. Years passed. The Whitford family became a ghost story told in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Old-timers spoke of the strange family that had vanished into the wilderness and of the settlement that appeared and disappeared like a fever dream. But most people dismissed it as exaggerated folklore, the kind of tale that grows taller with each telling. Grace Porter grew up knowing nothing of her mother's past. Her uncle and his wife, who raised her, told her only that her mother had died when she was a baby and that her mother had come from a troubled family that was no longer in the area. Grace was a bright, healthy child who showed no signs of the genetic issues that had plagued her mother's family. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1903, when Grace was 16 years old, something happened that revived all the old fears. Grace began having dreams, vivid, recurring dreams of a place she had never been, a meadow beside a stream, buildings arranged in a circle, people who looked like her, who called her by name, who told her she belonged with them. At first, she dismissed the dreams as nonsense, but they persisted, growing more detailed and more intense. She began to feel a pull, an inexplicable compulsion to go into the mountains, though she had no idea where or why. Her aunt noticed the change in her behavior and became worried. Grace was distracted, distant, speaking of feeling like she was missing something essential. Her aunt consulted the local doctor, who happened to be Dr. Edward Pryor, now in his 60s but still practicing. When he heard Grace's symptoms, and when he learned her full name and her mother's identity, he felt a chill run through him. He had treated Eliza, he knew the history, and now, 16 years after Eliza's death, her daughter was experiencing something that sounded disturbingly like a compulsion. Dr. Pryor spoke with Grace privately. He asked her to describe her dreams in detail. She told him about the meadow, the buildings, the people who all looked similar to each other and to her. She said they sang to her in her dreams, harmonies that she could still hear when she woke. She said there was an old man with a gray beard who called himself her grandfather and told her that her blood remembered what her mind had forgotten. Dr. Pryor made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told Grace everything. He retrieved his sealed study from his office and read portions of it to her. He told her about her mother's family, about the pattern of intermarriage, about the genetic consequences, about Eliza's escape and eventual suicide. He told her about the settlement found and lost in the mountains, and about the evidence that the family was still together, still following Josiah Whitford's vision. Grace listened in stunned silence. When Dr. Pryor finished, she asked him one question. "Am I like them? Is there something wrong with me because of the blood?" Dr. Pryor examined her carefully. Physically, she was perfectly healthy. Mentally, she seemed sound apart from the dreams. He told her honestly that she showed no signs of the issues that had plagued her mother's family, and that since her father had not been a Whitford, her genetic inheritance was likely diluted enough to avoid the worst consequences. But he warned her that the dreams worried him, not because he believed they were supernatural, but because they suggested that somehow the family knew about her and might be trying to reach her. Grace left Dr. Pryor's office with a burden of knowledge that no 16-year-old should carry. She understood now where she came from. She understood what her mother had escaped and why her mother had ultimately been unable to live with the memories. And she understood that somewhere in the mountains there were people who considered her one of them, who believed she belonged with them. The dreams continued. Grace tried to resist them, tried to tell herself they were merely her mind processing the terrible information she had learned, but they grew stronger. She began sleepwalking, waking to find herself walking toward the forest behind her home. Her aunt and uncle began locking her bedroom door at night for her own safety. In December of 1903, Grace disappeared. She left no note. Her bed was empty, the locked door somehow opened from the inside. A search was organized immediately. Dr. Pryor informed the authorities about Grace's history and his fears about what might have happened. Searchers combed the mountains for weeks. They found no trace. Grace Porter had vanished as completely as the Whitford family itself had vanished twice before. Her aunt and uncle were devastated. Dr. Pryor felt responsible. He had told her the truth, thinking it would help her resist whatever pull she felt. Instead, it seemed to have made things worse. In his journal, he wrote, "I fear I have sent that poor girl into the arms of the very evil her mother died trying to escape. The Whitford blood calls to itself," as the old man wrote. "I did not believe it then. I am not certain I believe it now, but I cannot explain what has happened any other way." The disappearance of Grace Porter marked the end of active investigation into the Whitford family. There was simply nothing more that could be done. The family had proven themselves capable of vanishing at will, of existing in the wilderness without leaving traces, of maintaining their isolation despite all efforts to locate them. The case files were closed. The property in the original hollow remained abandoned and unsold. The years passed into decades. The witnesses died. Sheriff Frost retired and was replaced. Dr. Edward Pryor died in 1917, taking with him much of the first-hand knowledge of the case. His study, sealed with the Kentucky Medical Society, was eventually filed away and forgotten. The Whitford family became nothing more than a local legend, a campfire story told to frighten children. But in 1929, something happened that proved the story was far from over. A surveying team working for the Cumberland Coal Company was mapping potential mining sites in the deep mountains of Harlan County. They were in an area that had never been surveyed before, accessible only by foot through terrain that had deterred previous expeditions. The team consisted of 5 men, the chief surveyor, Thomas Blackwood, and 4 assistants. They were experienced woodsmen, comfortable in the wilderness, and they expected their survey to take approximately 3 weeks. On their 8th day in the mountains, they came across something unexpected: a cemetery. It was located on a flat ridge overlooking a valley surrounded by forest. There were no roads, no trails, no signs of how anyone would access this place regularly. But there were graves, many graves. The surveying team counted 47 marked burial sites. The markers were simple wooden crosses, most bearing names and dates carved in rough letters. Thomas Blackwood, curious, began recording the names and dates. What he found disturbed him enough that he abandoned the survey and returned to Cumberland Gap immediately. Every single grave bore the surname Whitford. The dates ranged from 1875 to 1928, the year before. The family was still active, still in these mountains, still having children and still burying them. But the pattern of death dates was what truly disturbed Blackwood. More than half of the graves were for children under the age of 5. Many were for infants less than a year old. The rate of infant mortality was staggering, far beyond what would be expected even in an isolated mountain community. Blackwood brought his findings to the authorities. By this time, most people in Cumberland Gap who remembered the original Whitford case were gone. But there were records, and there was Dr. Pryor's sealed study, which was finally opened and examined. A new generation of lawmen and medical professionals looked at the case with fresh eyes. Dr. Martin Yates, who had taken over Dr. Pryor's practice, read the study with growing horror. He recognized the medical implications immediately. The Whitford family had been practicing intensive inbreeding for at least 3 generations, possibly 4 by this point. The genetic consequences would be severe. The high infant mortality rate made sense. Many children born of such close consanguinity would suffer from recessive genetic disorders that would prove fatal. Those who survived might carry hidden mutations that would be passed to the next generation, compounding the problem. Dr. Yates wrote to colleagues at the University of Kentucky, and together they decided that the case represented a public health emergency. A family of significant size was living in complete isolation, producing children who were suffering and dying at alarming rates, and refusing all contact with medical authorities who might help them. A large expedition was organized in April of 1929. It included representatives from the county government, medical personnel, law enforcement, and experienced mountain guides. Their goal was to locate the Whitford family, assess their condition, and offer assistance. If assistance was refused, they would determine whether legal intervention was necessary to protect the welfare of any children. The expedition used the cemetery as their starting point. They searched the surrounding valleys, looking for signs of habitation. On their 3rd day, they found it, a settlement in a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow gap in the rock formations that was nearly invisible from any angle except straight on. The settlement was larger than any of the previous descriptions. There were at least 15 structures visible, including a large central building that appeared to be a communal hall. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Laundry hung between trees. People were visible moving between buildings. The expedition approached carefully, calling out greetings and identifying themselves. They announced that they meant no harm and were there to offer medical assistance and to ensure the welfare of all residents, particularly the children. The people in the settlement stopped their activities and gathered in front of the central building. The expedition counted approximately 40 individuals, ranging from small children to elderly adults. They all stood in silence, watching the approaching group, and then an old man stepped forward from the crowd. He was in his 80s at least, tall and rail-thin, with a long white beard and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. He held a hand up, signaling the expedition to stop. They stopped about 50 yards away. The old man spoke, his voice still strong despite his age. "I am Josiah Whitford. You are trespassing on family land. State your purpose." Several members of the expedition recognized the name from the case files. Josiah Whitford, the patriarch who had started all of this, who had led his family into isolation in 1861, who had preached blood purity and arranged marriages between his own children. That Josiah would have been over 100 years old by 1929. This could not be the same man. Dr. Yates stepped forward and introduced himself. He explained that they had found the cemetery, that they were concerned about the high rate of infant mortality, and that they wished to offer modern medical care to anyone who needed it. The old man who called himself Josiah listened without expression. When Dr. Yates finished, Josiah replied, "We have no need of your medicine. We have no need of your concern. Our children who pass do so because they are not strong enough to carry the bloodline forward. This is natural. This is necessary. The weak fall away so that the strong may continue. You interfere with a process that you cannot understand." Dr. Yates tried to reason with him, explaining that many infant deaths could be prevented with proper medical care, that the pattern of deaths suggested genetic issues that would only worsen with continued close intermarriage. Josiah cut him off. "You speak of weakness as if it is something to be coddled and preserved. We speak of strength as something to be refined and concentrated. My grandfather knew this truth. He taught it to my father taught it to me, and I have taught it to my children. The Whitford blood is purer now than it was 70 years ago. The weak children die, the strong survive, and with each generation we come closer to perfection." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Dr. Yates was appalled. He tried to explain that this was not how human genetics worked, that purity of bloodline through intermarriage did not create strength but rather concentrated harmful recessive traits. Josiah smiled. "You believe what your books tell you. We believe what our blood tells us. Look at us, doctor. We are still here. We have survived in these mountains for nearly 70 years without your help. We are stronger than the soft people in your towns. We are united in purpose. We are a family in the truest sense. And we will continue long after your civilization has collapsed under the weight of its own weakness and moral decay." The standoff continued for hours. The expedition members tried various approaches. They appealed to compassion for the suffering children. They mentioned legal obligations to provide medical care to minors. They even offered to bring medical supplies and leave them for the family to use as they saw fit. Josiah refused every offer. Finally, as the sun began to set, Josiah made a pronouncement. "You will leave now. You will not return. You will not send others. This is our final warning. We have lived hidden for 70 years. We can remain hidden for 70 more. But if you force us to move again, if you continue to interfere, there will be consequences. We are 40 strong here, but there are others, other settlements, other branches of the family that have spread into different valleys. We are more numerous than you imagine. We watch the towns. We know who you are. We know where you live. Leave us in peace, or learn what it means to threaten a family that has no connection to your laws or your morality." It was a threat, clear and unambiguous. The expedition withdrew. They camped a mile away and debated what to do. Some argued for forcing the issue, for bringing in armed men and taking custody of the children by force if necessary. Others pointed out that Josiah's words suggested there were multiple settlements, meaning the family might number over 100 people, possibly more. A confrontation could turn violent. And there was the disturbing question of Josiah himself. The original Josiah Whitford would have been born around 1819. He would have been well over 100 years old. This man was old, but not impossibly so, which meant he was not the original patriarch. He was either a son or grandson who had taken the name, or perhaps the family had a tradition of naming the leader Josiah regardless of birth name. Either way, it suggested a level of organization and continuity that was deeply unsettling. The expedition returned to Cumberland Gap and filed a report with the state government. The response was bureaucratic and slow. Kentucky in 1929 was dealing with the early effects of the Great Depression. Resources were limited. A family of religious extremists living voluntarily in isolation was not a priority, particularly when attempting to help them might result in violence. The case was referred to various agencies, all of which determined that without evidence of specific criminal activity, there was little they could do. Parents had broad rights regarding their children's welfare, and if the family was not seeking government assistance, the government had limited grounds to intervene. The Whitford family remained in their hidden valley, and the world moved on. but the members of that expedition never forgot what they had seen. Dr. Martin Yates wrote extensively about the case, publishing several papers in medical journals about the dangers of isolated inbreeding populations. He used the Whitford case as an example, though he changed names and locations to protect privacy. Over the following years, there were occasional sightings of people in the deep mountains who fit the descriptions of Whitford family members. Hunters and trappers would report seeing groups of individuals who dressed plainly, who moved through the forest with practiced ease, and who fled if approached. A few claimed to have heard singing in the woods, that same strange harmony that had been described decades before. But no one found the settlements again. It was as if the family had learned to disappear more effectively, to hide their presence so thoroughly that even experienced woodsmen could pass nearby and never know they were there. In 1935, a young anthropology student from the University of Kentucky named Margaret Sullivan decided to make the Whitford family the subject of her master's thesis. She had read Dr. Yates' papers and was fascinated by the case. She spent 6 months researching, reading every available document, interviewing anyone still alive who had encountered the family. She compiled a comprehensive history that brought together all the scattered pieces of the story. In her conclusion, she wrote something that remains chilling to this day. She noted that if the family had continued at the rate suggested by the cemetery records, and if there were truly multiple settlements as Josiah had claimed, then by 1935, the Whitford family might number over 200 individuals. 200 people, all descended from the original 6 children of Josiah and Constance Whitford, all products of generations of intensive inbreeding, all living in complete isolation from modern society, all following the teachings of a patriarch who believed that blood purity was more important than the health or happiness of his descendants. Sullivan attempted to verify her population estimate by searching for other cemeteries or settlements, but she found nothing. The mountains were too vast, too rugged, and the family too skilled at concealment. Her thesis was approved and filed in the university library, where it gathered dust for decades. And there the story might have ended, fading into obscurity, another strange footnote in Appalachian history. But in 1968, something happened that proved the Whitford family was not only still extant, but had grown in ways that no one had imagined. A group of hikers on the newly established Cumberland Trail got lost in a remote section of the mountains. They wandered for 2 days before stumbling into a valley where they found a settlement. They were desperate, hungry, and dehydrated. They approached hopping to find help. The settlement was inhabited. There were people there, many people. The hikers called out, and several individuals emerged from the buildings. The hikers later described these individuals as appearing unusual but could not articulate exactly what they meant. They seemed healthy. They wore simple but clean clothing. But there was something in their faces, in the way they looked at the strangers, that made the hikers uncomfortable. The hikers asked for directions back to the trail. One of the individuals, a woman of perhaps 30, pointed toward the east and gave simple directions. The hikers thanked her and asked if they could refill their water bottles. The woman agreed and led them to a well. While they were filling their bottles, the hikers noticed children watching them from the doorways of buildings. Many children. They all looked similar, with the same narrow faces and widely spaced eyes. One of the hikers, a college student named David Marsh, had studied genetics. He recognized the signs of inbreeding. He said nothing, but he noted everything. The hikers left as quickly as they could, following the woman's directions. They reached the main trail by evening and hiked out the next day. David Marsh reported what he had seen to his professor, who in turn contacted state authorities. Another expedition was organized, this time by state park rangers who were responsible for the Cumberland Trail. They attempted to locate the settlement using David Marsh's description of the route, but they found nothing. The valley he described did not seem to exist, or at least could not be accessed by the route he remembered. The rangers concluded that the hikers had been disoriented and confused about their location, but David Marsh insisted on what he had seen. He wrote a detailed account. including his observations about the children and his professional opinion that the settlement was home to a population suffering from significant genetic issues resulting from inbreeding. His account was filed with the Park Service and forgotten. The case of the Whitford family drifted back into obscurity. The few people who knew about it were academics, local historians, and elderly residents of Cumberland Gap who remembered the old stories. The world had changed. The mountains of eastern Kentucky were no longer as isolated as they had been in the 19th century. Roads had been built, tourism had increased, mining operations had expanded into previously inaccessible areas. The idea that a large, isolated family could still be living hidden in the wilderness seemed increasingly implausible. And yet, the evidence suggested otherwise. The sightings continued, though rarely. Every few years, someone would report seeing people in the deep mountains who fled from contact. Hunters would find signs of habitation in remote areas, only to return and find nothing. There were stories, always stories, of singing heard in the woods, of children who all looked alike, of old men with fierce eyes who warned strangers to stay away. In 1994, a team of researchers from the Appalachian Studies program at East Tennessee State University decided to investigate the Whitford legend comprehensively. They obtained funding for a year-long project that would involve extensive archival research, oral history interviews, and field expeditions into the remote areas where the family had reportedly lived. The team was led by Dr. Sarah Brennan, an anthropologist who specialized in isolated communities. Dr. Brennan approached the project with academic skepticism. She suspected that the Whitford family story had been greatly exaggerated over the decades, that the reality was probably a much smaller family that had lived in isolation for a time in the 19th century and had either died out or been absorbed into the larger population. She expected to find a fascinating case of social isolation and possibly some evidence of genetic issues, but nothing like the multi-generational horror story that had been described in the various accounts. Her team spent months in archives, examining documents, reading Dr. Pryor's original study, which had finally been made available to researchers, studying the census records, and interviewing descendants of people who had known about the family. They compiled a database of every known fact, every sighting, every piece of evidence. And what emerged was more disturbing than Dr. Brennan had anticipated. The documentary evidence was extensive and consistent. This was not a legend that had grown in the telling. It was a real family, with real members, who had engaged in deliberate, systematic inbreeding over multiple generations. The medical consequences had been real and severe. And most disturbing, there was no evidence that the family had ever stopped existing. There were no records of mass deaths, no evidence of the family rejoining society, no graves in public cemeteries. The family had simply continued, hidden, for over 130 years. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the summer of 1995, Dr. Brennan's team conducted field expeditions into the mountains. They hired experienced guides who knew the terrain. They used topographical maps and GPS technology to search areas that had been described in historical accounts. For weeks, they found nothing. And then, in July, they found a cemetery. It was not the same cemetery that had been discovered in 1929. This one was in a different location entirely, on a wooded slope overlooking a different valley, but it was unmistakably a Whitford cemetery. The wooden crosses had mostly rotted away, but some remained, and the names and dates were still legible. The most recent date was 1992, 3 years before. The family was still active, still burying their dead in hidden mountain cemeteries, still maintaining their isolation. Dr. Brennan's team photographed everything, documented the site meticulously, and attempted to use the cemetery as a starting point to locate the associated settlement. They searched for 3 days, covering every accessible part of the surrounding area. They found no settlement, no trails, no signs of habitation. On their fourth day, as they were preparing to leave, they heard it, singing, multiple voices in harmony coming from somewhere in the valley below them. The sound was beautiful and eerie, a melody that seemed to drift on the wind. Dr. Brennan and her team tried to locate the source of the sound, but the acoustics of the valley made it impossible to determine direction. The singing continued for perhaps 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The researchers called out, identifying themselves as university scholars who meant no harm and only wished to speak with the community about their history. There was no response. The forest was utterly silent. Not even birds sang. The team waited for an hour, but nothing happened. As the sun began to set, they made the decision to return to their base camp. As they were hiking out, one of the team members, a graduate student named Michael Torres, noticed something. They were being watched. He saw a figure standing in the trees about 50 yards away, perfectly still, partially obscured by shadow. He alerted Dr. Brennan and the entire team stopped. They looked at the figure. It appeared to be a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, wearing a simple dress. She did not move. She simply watched them. Dr. Brennan called out a greeting. The young woman did not respond. Dr. Brennan took a step toward her, and the young woman turned and walked into the deeper forest, moving with a grace that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. She disappeared in moments. The team debated following her but decided against it. It was growing dark and they were in unfamiliar territory. They made their way back to camp, unsettled by the encounter. That night, as they sat around their fire, they heard movement in the woods around them. Not close, but circling, as if they were being observed from multiple positions. No one slept well. The next morning, they packed their equipment and left the mountains. Dr. Brennan decided that further field expeditions would be too dangerous without better preparation and possibly official support. Back at the university, the team compiled their findings into a comprehensive report. Dr. Brennan presented their research at a conference on Appalachian culture, and her presentation caused considerable controversy. Some academics questioned whether the family could truly still exist after so many generations of intensive inbreeding. The genetic consequences, they argued, would be so severe that the family would have collapsed decades ago. But Dr. Brennan pointed to the evidence: the cemetery with fresh graves, the singing they had heard, the young woman who had watched them. Something was in those mountains, some community that had maintained isolation and secrecy for over a century. The report attracted media attention. Several newspapers ran stories about the mysterious Whitford family, and the tale was featured on a television program about unsolved mysteries. The publicity was unwelcome to Dr. Brennan, who had hoped to continue research without turning the family into a spectacle. But the damage was done. The story had entered popular culture. And then, in 1996, Dr. Brennan received a letter. It was delivered to her university office, postmarked from a small town near Harlan County but with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in precise, old-fashioned handwriting. The letter read, "Dr. Brennan, we know of your interest in our family. We appreciate that your intentions are academic rather than hostile, but we ask that you cease your investigations. We have lived as we choose for many generations. We harm no one. We ask nothing from the outside world. We wish only to be left alone. Your research brings attention that endangers our way of life. Please respect our choice to remain separate. If you cannot do this, we will move again as we have moved before, but we would prefer not to abandon the land we have cultivated for so long. The decision is yours. Consider carefully." Signed, a descendant of Josiah Whitford. Dr. Brennan was deeply unsettled by the letter. It confirmed that the family was aware of her research and was monitoring the outside world closely enough to know about her conference presentation and her university position. It also suggested that the family had the capability to relocate entirely if pressured, which meant they had resources and organization beyond what anyone had imagined. She consulted with colleagues about how to respond. Some urged her to continue the research, arguing that the family's existence was a matter of public interest and that their isolation might be harming children who needed medical care. Others argued that if the family was living peacefully and voluntarily, they had a right to privacy. Dr. Brennan made a difficult decision. She suspended active field research but continued archival work. She would document the history thoroughly but would not attempt to locate or contact the family again. She felt she owed them that much. Her decision was criticized by some, but she stood by it. In her final published paper on the subject, she wrote, "The Whitford family represents a unique case in American social history, a multi-generational experiment in isolation and endogamy that has persisted for over 130 years. The genetic and social consequences have been severe, yet the family continues. They have adapted to their circumstances in ways that allow them to survive, if not thrive. Whether this survival is ethical, whether the children born into this community are victims or willing participants, these are questions I cannot answer. What I can say is that the Whitford family has chosen a path that diverges entirely from mainstream society, and they have paid a terrible price for that choice. But it remains their choice. And in a free society, we must question how far we can go in forcing help upon those who do not want it, even when we believe that help is desperately needed." The debate continued in academic circles for several years, but eventually, interest faded. The Whitford family story became another obscure topic, studied by a few specialists but unknown to the general public. And there, the matter rested for more than 2 decades. Until 2018, when a hiker using GPS tracking technology noticed something unusual. He was mapping his route through the mountains of Harlan County when his GPS recorded a series of coordinates that, when plotted on a map, formed a pattern. The pattern suggested multiple settlements in remote valleys, arranged in a rough circle with a diameter of approximately 15 miles. Each potential settlement was located in terrain that was difficult to access, invisible from any road or trail, and positioned in a way that suggested careful planning. The hiker, whose name was Robert Klein, was a GIS specialist who worked for a mapping company. He recognized the pattern as unlikely to be natural. He shared his findings with researchers at the University of Kentucky, who examined the data with interest. They overlaid the GPS coordinates with historical records of Whitford sightings and cemetery locations. The correlation was striking. Every reported Whitford location fell within or near the circle suggested by Klein's data. The researchers proposed a theory. The Whitford family had not remained in a single location. Instead, they had established multiple settlements arranged in a network, allowing them to spread out over a larger territory while maintaining contact with each other. This would explain how they had avoided detection for so long. If pressed in one location, they could temporarily relocate to another. If one settlement was discovered, the others remained hidden. It was a sophisticated survival strategy for a family determined to maintain isolation. The researchers debated whether to mount a new expedition to investigate, but ultimately decided against it. The ethical issues raised by Dr. Brennan remained unresolved. What right did outsiders have to intrude on a community that wished to be left alone, even if that community was engaged in practices that seemed harmful? The question had no easy answer. And so, as we enter the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the Whitford family remains a mystery. They are out there, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, living according to the principles established by their patriarch over 160 years ago. How many of them are there now? What is their condition? What has become of the children born into this isolated world? These questions have no answers. But there is one more piece to this story. One final disturbing detail that emerged in 2023. A genealogist working on Appalachian family histories was examining DNA databases, the kind used by people seeking to trace their ancestry. She noticed a cluster of DNA matches that formed an unusually tight pattern, indicating individuals who shared significant amounts of genetic material. The cluster included over 60 people, all with different names, living in different parts of eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. None of them used the surname Whitford. But when the genealogist analyzed the genetic relationships, she found that all 60 individuals were descended from a common ancestor within the last 5 to 7 generations. The amount of shared DNA suggested intensive inbreeding. These were people who carried the genetic signature of an isolated, endogamous population. The genealogist contacted several of these individuals to ask about their family histories. Most did not respond, but 3 did, and their stories were remarkably similar. They had been raised in isolated mountain communities. They had large extended families who all lived together. They had been taught that outsiders were not to be trusted and that family bonds were sacred above all else. And at some point, usually in their late teens or early 20s, they had chosen to leave. They had been allowed to go, though not encouraged. They had changed their surnames, moved to cities or towns, and built new lives. But they carried with them the genetic legacy of their origins. The genealogist asked if any of them had heard the name Whitford. One of them, a woman now in her 50s who had left her community in 1987, said yes. She said that the old people in her childhood community spoke of the original family, the founding family, whose commitment to blood purity had inspired others to follow the same path. She said there were multiple families now, spread across the mountains, all following similar practices, all connected by blood and philosophy. She said the name Whitford was spoken with reverence, as the name of those who had shown the way. The genealogist asked how many people might be living in these communities. The woman said she did not know, but based on her own community, which had numbered about 80 when she left, and based on her knowledge that there were at least 5 or 6 similar communities, she estimated that there might be 400 to 500 individuals total, possibly more. 400 to 500 people, all living in isolation, all products of generations of intensive inbreeding, all hidden in the mountains of Appalachia, all descended from or inspired by Josiah Whitford's vision of blood purity. The genetic consequences for these populations would be catastrophic. The rate of genetic disorders would be extraordinarily high. The infant mortality rate would be severe. The long-term viability of such populations was questionable at best, and yet they persisted. They survived. They continued. The genealogist published her findings in a genetic anthropology journal, and once again, the story of the Whitford family entered the public consciousness briefly before fading away. The ethical debates resumed. The questions remained unanswered. And in the mountains, the singing continued. Hikers still occasionally report hearing harmonized voices in remote valleys. Hunters still occasionally glimpse people who flee from contact. And every few years, someone stumbles across a cemetery in the woods, crosses marking graves, all bearing names that sound old-fashioned and biblical, all clustered together as if even in death, these people could not bear to be separated from their kin. This is the legacy of Josiah Whitford, a family, or perhaps now multiple families, bound together by blood that has been circled back upon itself so many times that it has become something other than it was. These are people who exist in the margins, in the forgotten spaces, in the wild places that civilization has not yet fully tamed. They are the result of one man's obsession with purity, taken to its ultimate, terrible conclusion across nearly 200 years. And here we must confront the question that has haunted this case from the beginning. Are they victims, or are they willing participants in their own isolation? Are the children born into these communities being harmed, or are they simply living according to a different set of values that we find disturbing but which they accept? Who has the right to intervene? Who has the obligation? These questions have no comfortable answers. What we know is this. The Whitford family began with 6 children and 2 parents in 1861. They were fleeing a world they saw as corrupt and impure. They believed that by keeping their bloodline untainted, they would create something stronger, something better. Instead, they created a generational tragedy, a slow-motion genetic catastrophe that has claimed hundreds of lives through infant mortality, genetic disorders, and the psychological damage of absolute isolation. They created communities where children are born knowing no world beyond their family, where the gene pool has become so restricted that every child carries multiple copies of harmful recessive alleles, where the future is constrained by the sins of the past. And yet, the family persists. Against all logic, against all predictions, they survive. Perhaps there is something we do not understand about human resilience. Perhaps there is something in the human spirit that can endure even the most terrible circumstances. Or perhaps what we are seeing is not survival but a kind of living death, a zombie existence where the forms of life continue, but the essence has been long since consumed. We may never know. The Whitford family has proven itself capable of remaining hidden for as long as necessary. They have outlasted sheriffs, doctors, researchers, and journalists. They have survived the Civil War, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the modern age of surveillance and satellite imagery. They have done this through a combination of geographical isolation, social cohesion, and absolute commitment to their way of life. And perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. Not the genetic consequences, not the dead infants, not the isolation, but the commitment. The unwavering belief that what they are doing is right, that the suffering is justified, that the price paid in blood and pain and early graves is worth paying for the sake of an abstract principle of purity. Josiah Whitford convinced his children that blood purity was more important than their happiness. Those children convinced their children. And so on down through the generations. The belief has become self-sustaining, a closed loop of ideology that admits no outside information, no contradictory evidence, no alternative worldview. It is in a very real sense a cult of blood, a cult that worships ancestry and abhors contamination, a cult that has sacrificed hundreds of its own children on the altar of genetic purity. And it continues. Right now, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Kentucky or Tennessee or Virginia, there are children being born into Whitford-descended communities. Children who will grow up never attending school, never seeing a doctor, never interacting with anyone outside their extended family. Children who will be told that they are special, chosen, pure. Children who will be married to their cousins or siblings when they come of age. Children who will produce their own children, continuing the cycle. And some of those children will die. Many will die. The genetic odds are against them, but some will survive, and those survivors will carry the concentrated genetic legacy of their ancestors, both the strengths and the terrible weaknesses. Is there anything that can be done? Should anything be done? The legal framework for intervention is murky. These communities are not easily accessible. They are skilled at hiding. They have resources we do not fully understand. And any attempt at forced intervention would likely result in the community's scattering, going even deeper into hiding, making conditions even worse for the children we are supposedly trying to help. Some researchers have suggested a different approach, outreach rather than intervention, making modern medical care available but not mandatory, offering education but not forcing it, creating pathways for those who wish to leave to do so safely, as the genealogist's informants did. But this approach requires patience and resources, and there is no guarantee it would work. The communities have resisted outside contact for so long that trust may be impossible to establish. And so we are left with an unsolvable problem. A hidden population, possibly numbering in the hundreds, living in conditions we would consider unacceptable but doing so voluntarily based on beliefs they hold sacred. We know they are there. We know they are suffering. We know children are dying, but we cannot reach them and they will not reach out to us. This is the true horror of the Whitford family story. Not the medical details, not the disturbing genetics, not even the dead infants in unmarked graves. The real horror is the wall of ideology that has been built between these people and the rest of humanity, a wall so high and so strong that it has withstood nearly 2 centuries of social change and progress. Behind that wall, people live and die according to rules established by a man who has been dead for over 100 years, a man whose descendants carry out his vision with religious fervor even as it destroys them from within. And there is one more thing. One final detail that brings this entire case into sharp, disturbing focus. Remember Grace Porter, the daughter of Eliza Whitford who disappeared in 1903. The genealogist who studied the DNA patterns found something interesting. Several of the individuals in her database, the ones who had left the mountain communities, shared genetic markers with a sample that had been taken from Grace Porter's daughter during a medical procedure in the 1950s. Grace's daughter, who had been raised by adopted parents and knew nothing of her mother's history, had apparently passed on genetic material that now showed up in multiple isolated individuals across Appalachia. Which means that Grace did not just disappear, she joined the family. She went to them or they came to her and she became part of the breeding population. The compulsion she felt, the dreams that drew her to the mountains were not supernatural. They were simply the final success of the family's patient watching and waiting. They had known about her. They had called to her in ways we do not fully understand. And she had answered. Grace Porter had children. Those children had children. And now, over a century later, her genetic legacy has spread through the hidden communities, one more strand woven into the increasingly tangled web of Whitford blood. She is there, in the DNA of people living today in those mountains. She is part of the pattern now. She became what her mother had died trying to prevent her from becoming. This is what the Whitford family does. This is their power. They persist. They adapt. They draw back those who carry their blood. They have been doing this for nearly 200 years, and they show no signs of stopping. Somewhere in the mountains right now, children are being told the old stories. They are learning about Josiah Whitford, the founder, the prophet of blood purity. They are being taught that outsiders are corrupt and weak. They are being prepared to marry their cousins, to have children who will carry on the tradition, to sacrifice anything and everything for the sake of family unity and genetic continuity. And most of them will never leave. Most will never know there is another way to live. They will be born, they will reproduce, and they will die within the same few square miles where their ancestors lived and died, never venturing beyond the boundaries of their isolated valleys, never questioning the beliefs that have been passed down through the generations. This is the final truth of the Whitford family. They have created a self-sustaining system of isolation and inbreeding that requires no external support and recognizes no external authority. They are, in a very real sense, a separate people. Not genetically, though they like to believe they are, but culturally, ideologically, they have diverged from mainstream humanity to a degree that may be unbridgeable. They are the ultimate endpoint of a philosophy that values blood above all else. And that philosophy has created a population that is slowly deteriorating, generation by generation, as harmful genetic mutations accumulate and compound. Without outside intervention, without fresh genetic material, these communities will eventually collapse. The mathematics of population genetics makes this inevitable, but that collapse may take generations. And in the meantime, children will continue to be born into a system that ensures many of them will suffer and die. So what should we do? What can we do? These are questions that have haunted everyone who has ever studied this case, from Dr. Edward Pryor in 1887 to Dr. Sarah Brennan in 1995 to the researchers working today. The answer, uncomfortable as it is, may be that we can do nothing. We can document. We can bear witness. We can make resources available for those who choose to leave, but we cannot force salvation upon people who do not want it. We cannot rescue those who do not believe they need rescuing. And so the Whitford family, in all their iterations and offshoots, will continue until they finally exhaust the limited genetic resources they possess, or until some external event disrupts their isolation beyond their ability to recover. It may take another 100 years. It may happen tomorrow. We do not know. What we do know is that right now, somewhere in the forested mountains of eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, or Virginia, there is a child being born. That child carries the genetic legacy of Josiah and Constance Whitford. That child will never attend a public school, never visit a hospital, never see a television or use a computer. That child will grow up surrounded by people who look remarkably similar, who share not only surname but significant amounts of genetic material. That child may be healthy, or that child may suffer from one of the many genetic disorders that plague intensely inbred populations. The child's chances of survival to adulthood are lower than they should be. If the child survives, the child will eventually be expected to marry within the family and produce more children, continuing the cycle. And somewhere, perhaps in a university library or a medical archive, someone may someday document that child's existence as another data point in the ongoing tragedy of the Whitford family. But the child will never know that. The child will live and die believing that the life they led was normal, natural, and good. The child will never know what they lost by being born into isolation. And perhaps that is a mercy. Perhaps it is better not to know what you have never had. Or perhaps that ignorance is the cruelest aspect of all, the final insult added to generations of injury. We cannot answer these questions. We can only observe, document, and wonder at the human capacity for both survival and self-destruction. The Whitford family has shown us something about the limits of human adaptability, about what happens when ideology becomes more important than individual welfare, about the terrible consequences of taking an idea to its absolute extreme and maintaining it across generations. They are a warning, if we are willing to heed it. A warning about the dangers of isolation, about the toxicity of absolute belief, about the harm that can be done in the name of purity. But they are also, in a strange way, a testament to human resilience. Against all odds, against all logic, they survive. They continue. They maintain their identity and their cohesion in the face of genetic disaster and social isolation that would destroy most communities. There is something both admirable and horrifying in that persistence, something that speaks to the strength of human will and the tragedy of human stubbornness in equal measure. And so we are left with the question that has no answer, the question that hangs over this entire case like the smoke from those hidden fires in the mountain valleys. Are the Whitford family and their descendants victims, or are they monsters? Are they people who need our help, or are they people who have made their choice and should be left alone? The answer, uncomfortable and unsatisfying, is probably both. They are victims of a system created by their ancestors, a system they did not choose but cannot escape. And they are perpetuators of that system, continuing to subject new generations to the same suffering they endured. They are trapped in a cycle that began over 160 years ago, and that cycle shows no signs of breaking. Somewhere in those mountains right now, someone is singing. Many voices in harmony, creating melodies that have been passed down through generations, songs that have never been written down or recorded, songs that exist only in the memories of those who sing them. The songs are beautiful by all accounts, haunting and pure, and they are being sung by people whose bodies carry the genetic signatures of collapse, whose family trees form closed loops instead of spreading branches, whose future is constrained by decisions made by ancestors long dead. This is the legacy of Josiah Whitford. This is what became of his dream of purity, not strength but weakness, not greatness but suffering. Not a family that would flourish undisturbed, but a family that has been disturbed from within, broken by its own practices, sustained only by isolation and absolute belief. And the most disturbing question of all, the one that we must ask even though we cannot answer it, is this. If we were born into that system, if we had known nothing else, if we had been taught from birth that this was right and good and natural, would we be able to see the truth? Would we be able to recognize the horror for what it is? Or would we, like so many generations of Whitfords before us, simply accept it as the way things are and continue the cycle? That question is the real horror at the heart of this case. Not the medical details, not the genetic consequences, not the disturbing practices. The real horror is the possibility that any of us, under the right circumstances, could become what the Whitfords became. That given enough isolation, enough indoctrination, enough repetition of belief across enough generations, any family could fall into the same trap. The Whitford family is not a historical curiosity, it is a warning, and that warning has gone unheeded for nearly 2 centuries. The family continues. The children are born. The cycle repeats. And in the offices of researchers and in the minds of ethicists and in the case files of various agencies, the question remains open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What do we do about the Whitford family? The only honest answer is that we do not know. We have never known. And the family in their hidden valleys, surrounded by the bones of their ancestors and the uncertain future of their descendants, continue their singing, continue their isolation, continue their terrible experiment in blood purity. This is where the story ends, or rather, where our knowledge of it ends. The actual story continues, hidden from view, unfolding in real time in places we cannot see. And until something changes, until the family finally collapses under the weight of its own genetic burden, or until someone finds a way to reach through the wall of ideology and offer genuine help that will be accepted, the Whitford family secret will remain what it has always been. Not a mystery that can be solved, but a tragedy that can only be witnessed. A reminder that sometimes the most terrible things in human history are not the work of monsters, but of ordinary people who believed absolutely in an idea and pursued it to its logical, devastating conclusion. And that, perhaps, is the lesson we must take from the mountains of eastern Kentucky. That ideas have consequences, that isolation breeds darkness, and that purity, pursued absolutely, becomes poison. The Whitford family believed they were creating something better. Instead, they created a generational nightmare that has lasted nearly 200 years and shows no signs of ending. That is their legacy. That is their secret. And somewhere right now it continues.